Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Episode number 355 of We Are Podcast. We took a little bit of a break because we wanted to bring We Are Podcast back more regularly. We had moved to a fortnightly schedule, and from now onwards, we're on a weekly schedule. So get us every week into your ears. And this podcast is specifically for business owners who want to use their podcast to grow their business, grow credibility, revenue, and audience. Today I have Charles Gaudet. He's the second time he's appeared on the show, but we're talking very specifically about how he's using his podcast. And by the way, he is a legend. He is the author of Predictable Profits Playbook, obviously the host of Beyond the Seven Figures podcast. If you don't know that podcast, you should go check it out. It is very specifically conversations with people who are in that space that can unlock some of the things if you are under the seven-figure mark, which is really valuable, especially when you're growing and you've not have done it before. So we talk about some really interesting things, including how to use the podcast to grow the business and why there's not only just one way to monetize, so to speak, the podcast. And when you have a good business and you have a podcast, it returns in multiple different ways. So this is episode 355. Come, let's learn.
Charlie Gaudet, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for making the time. You are CEO of multiple companies, founder of multiple companies, host of a podcast, a high-level coach for businesses looking to grow past seven figures and beyond. Predictable profits beyond seven figures. You've got way too many brands that I can count. It's an absolute pleasure to chat with you and have a little bit of time, energy, and space and share that with you because I know how busy you are. So thank you for being on the show.
It's an honor for me to be here. Thank you so much.
Let's talk about the podcast. You've had a podcast for a long time. You're over 200 episodes in now, if I'm correct. And when you introduce yourself, do you call yourself a podcaster?
That's a good question. I don't call myself a podcaster, but there's actually an interesting dynamic because if people found me from my book, there's a level of authority. If people find me from my website, there's a little lower authority if it's just from the website, because, book, there's that perceived authority. But if people find me from my podcast, then there's like, oh, you're a celebrity almost, which is, it's kind of funny because when they hear you and they hear you repeatedly, then there's a different level of perceived authority. So it's actually quite fascinating.
When you break it down, and I've been obviously talking about podcasts for 11 years. So one of the things I've been saying for a long time is the auditory sense is the most connected sense, the most authentic sense. We've been listening to stories, and that's been, sitting around fires and having conversations, and that's when you build trust. But more importantly, as a parent, you sing and talk to your kids even before they're born. And there's a reason for that. The auditory sense is such a powerful sense that you build this trust with whoever is listening to you. So I'm not surprised at those results. But what comes to mind when you look back at the last 200 episodes? Is there anything surprising that has happened?
Yeah, well, actually, the most surprising thing is, this is probably not the most PC thing to say, but I almost wish there was a way I could go back and delete my early episodes because I was so bad. But if I was aiming for perfection, I probably never would have launched a podcast. And frankly, if I was aiming for perfection, I probably wouldn't be doing the podcast episodes that I do right now, not because they're not perfect. It's just because that my illusion of what a perfect podcast looked like, but what actually seems to be resonating with people is a little different. So I tweeted the other day, I was talking to my chief of staff, and one of the sayings we have in the company is that done is better than perfect. I mean, look, you look at, actors' first movies aren't nearly as good as the movies they are today. You look at Gary V's first podcast, first video, they're nowhere close to where it is today. It's like the only people that make it really successful today are the ones that have the courage to make mistakes in the very beginning in a very public forum.
I mean, there's so much to unpack in what you just said, because I've done over 1,500 interviews, and every 20 episodes, I would love to go back and change some things that I've just learned in these 20 episodes. When you're looking at helping people and coaching people, what gets in their way of even starting? Because it seems like that seems like a big jump. Is perfection getting in their way? Is the idea that they have to get it right because they're the expert? What are you seeing?
So every person on the planet has a degree of these noises that go on in their head that either say, I'm not smart enough, I'm not good enough, I'm not loved enough, I'm not all this other stuff. When I'm talking with my clients, whether or not we're talking about a guarantee that they're going to put, an offer that they're going to make, a profit center they're going to launch, whatever it is, one of the gut checks that I'll often ask them is, how's that make you feel? And if they're like, you know what, I feel great, I go, okay, let's lean in a little bit more. And they, wait, what do you mean? I go, let's lean in a little bit more. And I'm like, I need you to feel just slightly nervous, slightly uncomfortable, because if it's safe, we're not thinking big enough. We're not being bold enough. Let's go a little bit more. There's several billionaires and centimillionaires that I've met and I've studied and whatnot that have all this understanding that, their biggest success came on the other side of fear. And I think it was Jack Canfield that talked about success is on the other side of fear. And so when we look at things like what should we be doing in the podcast and so forth, like if it makes us a little bit nervous, if we get a little scared, that should be an indication that that's what we should be doing right now. If it makes you nervous, makes you a little uncomfortable, then maybe a reason why that is. You're likely going in the right direction.
It's hilarious you're saying that, because this year I've gotten into artificial intelligence and I didn't want to be the AI guy because I spent so much of time being the podcast guy and built all these assets being the podcast guy. And I was reluctant to be the AI guy. And I kept remembering this quote. And when I was training to be a chef, is Ronsley, if you're trying to solve a problem that can be solved in your lifetime, you're thinking too small. And it has been something that has come up this year a lot. And as a result, obviously, I've stepped into this new identity as being the AI and the podcast guy. But I totally understand what you mean, because it was scaring the big Jesus out of me, despite being a computer scientist and a software engineer and, doing all these other stuff. It still is very, very scary to be in a space that you're trying something entirely new.
So several years ago, I had a conversation with Tony Robbins, and Tony said to me, you think Richard Branson would look at that and say those are big problems or little problems? And I'm like, oh, well, probably little problems. And he goes, let's put this into perspective. When you say little problems, do you think that Richard Branson would look at your problems? And would they be so small that he probably wouldn't even lose maybe a second of sleep? And I'm like, well, probably. And he goes, huh. I said, Tony, why'd you ask? And he said, because I'm sizing you up. He said, you see, big people have big problems. Little people have little problems. You can tell the size of the person by the size of their problems. Little people will run away from their problems, but big people will create big problems for themselves. So if you're sitting there and you're going, I don't know if I should record a podcast. That makes me a little bit nervous. What if people think that I'm dumb? I don't know if I'm smart enough. I don't know what I should talk about. I don't know this and that. Ask yourself, is that a little problem or a big problem? Right. And we're probably looking at it from the wrong perspective. Instead of saying, am I smart enough? Am I doing this and that? Be like, no. Just change the conversation. If you're going to do a podcast, what's the impact that you want that podcast to make? Let's make that a big problem. What is the impact that you want to make, and to how many people? And when they listen to your podcast, what do you want them walking away from feeling, thinking, doing? Do you want to inspire a certain amount of action or behavior? Do you want to encourage people to think about their current actions and maybe change behaviors? Do you want somebody to listen to the podcast and just feel this over sense of love and gratitude and embrace somebody and spread some of the positivity around the world? Or, or what is it? Or maybe you're just creating a podcast because you want to create consumption that gets people to identify that what they're doing right now isn't enough to get them to where they want to go in the future. And so that consumption continues to build that demand for, your products and your services and the way that you can help them, because you fundamentally believe that you can change lives and that you have a moral and ethical obligation to be able to put that in as many hands as possible to change the world in your own way. Because we get paid in direct proportion to the value that we put out there.
You were talking about different things and why you have the podcast. Why did you create the podcast? And has the purpose of the podcast changed over the last 200 episodes?
So I created the podcast because somebody told me I should have a podcast. Like if I'm going to be completely honest with you, that's why I did it. But I did it, and then only after I did it, we looked at the data, we looked at what's working, what's not working, and then all of a sudden we started to see why I should have a podcast and why having a podcast is a good idea. See, the reason why I hesitated for so long is not only did I have those voices in my head like everybody else does, right? Like, what am I going to say? I was diagnosed with all these learning disabilities. And so I'm like, oh, I'm going to sound like a bumbling idiot. And I've never run a podcast. I don't listen to podcasts myself because I work from home and I'm not in the car. And, I'm telling myself all these stories like across the board. Right? And then I just did it. And one of the things that we found was that the more people consumed podcasts, the more likely they were to buy. And even the people that we had conversations with that didn't end up working with us right off the bat, they continued to listen to the podcast. And then there was something that was said on the podcast that all of a sudden got them to sit back on their heels and go, whoa, that changes everything. And then it reaches out and they connect with us. And so we discovered that it's actually consumption that drives conversion. And everybody has a different amount of consumption that they need in order to feel comfortable with making a particular decision. There's a gentleman that just recently signed up to work with me, and he listened to 187 episodes of the podcast before finally making the decision to, hey, let's work together. And there's been several people around the world when we've talked about this consumption drives conversion strategy. And I've asked, how many of you have listened to at least one episode of my podcast? And the majority of the people have. So people will consume content in many different ways. But if you can get yourself to the point where people will say the 4 magic words, which is I see you everywhere, your conversion rate from I see you everywhere will shoot through the roof. And if you're a busy CEO, a busy executive, busy leader, busy entrepreneur, whatever that might be, selfishly, there's no better way to produce content at scale than a podcast. Look at you and I right now. We're recording this on video, plus we've got the audio. We can take from here snippets and key results, and we could use AI to pull key results from the transcript, and that can become social. We can turn this into a YouTube series, an episode. We can go and we can extract key points from this conversation and turn that into an email and have that value-added email to the list. We turn this into an article and have an article. So one podcast takes care of all your content requirement needs, the right system and the right process. So 1 hour of your day, you have the right team and you have the right support structure. 1 hour of your day, you get everything you need, all your content for the whole week and then some.
And more importantly, the relationship. We just developed the relationship for that hour. It's apart from the content. And I've been saying this for a while that, people think of a podcast as a marketing tool or a content tool, but I believe it's the best business development tool that has ever existed. And it's a platform that has been very, very useful. And, I've been doing this for 11 years. And when I first started off, no one knew what a podcast was. And I would go into these companies and say, hey, I think you need a podcast. And they would look at me and like, this guy's a jackass, and throw me out of the office. I'm exaggerating, obviously. And then I'm like, I'm saying something wrong. So I would go back and I would say, you know what? I think you should storytell using audio. And then they would think about what I just said. And then they would throw me out of the office because they still didn't get it. And then after about a few months, I started to say this. Do you know how every conversion in your business happens in a conversation? And they would nod. Well, why don't you record those conversations and put them out so that people can listen to you even before they decide whether they want to buy from you? And then they went, oh, I should start a podcast.
Yeah.
And so it has been such a good journey to break this idea of podcasting down. And every time I'm having these conversations, especially with people who have podcasted, I'm learning myself and learning more. We've been doing your podcast, and one of the main reasons for me to have this conversation is I want to understand, as a podcaster, because you just record and everything else gets done. I
Yeah.
want to know how that feels. I want to know what that's like for you. What has that last year working with us been like? Anything that comes to mind that you would love to share that would be extremely useful.
Awesome. So I think the best analogy that I can give you is, and for the listeners, let's say you're going to hire a financial planner, right? Or realtor, something like that, right? But you're hiring somebody that's going to, that you're trusting with your money or your big decisions or whatnot. And all of a sudden that they show up to your front door in a 1986 Honda Accord, right? Rust on the doors, the faded paint and whatnot. They could have all the accolades that you'd be looking for, all the experience in the world, all the press mentions, but they pull up in this 1986 Honda Accord, and your gut tells you something's not right. Something's not connecting. That's the difference when you're bringing in and you're just doing a regular podcast and you don't have the right audio tuning. You don't have everything designed the way that it should. When people are trying to get to know you and their first impression is that 1986 Honda Accord pulling in the driveway, there's this preconceived notion that something is a little off. And so they're going to be a little more hesitant. It's going to take them longer to make buying decisions because what they believe to be true and what actually is true are two different things. I think that would be the biggest difference. The unconscious response in listening is, okay, this is what I would expect. It's the same way you walk into a Nordstrom, you expect premium experience versus walking into a Walmart, you're not really expecting it. So when people walk in to your world, are they going to get a Nordstrom experience or are they going to get a Walmart experience?
Yeah. I love that analogy. And while we were starting this conversation, I was asking you whether you noticed some of the changes that we made, and you didn't. And what you were telling me about responses that people were having. Could you elaborate on that if you don't mind?
Sure. Well, one of the most obvious ones was recently somebody said to me, man, I love the lengths of your episode. The episodes are so perfect. It's great. And I'm like, oh, that's awesome. Now I usually record for 45 minutes. And then I went to my podcast recently and I'm like, wait, everything's between 25 and 30 minutes. Like, wait a minute. I thought we recorded for longer. How did that happen? And then I realized that your team removes a lot of the half sentences, a lot of the gaps in conversation, a lot of this and that, which kept things moving and lively and engaging and so forth. So yeah, little things like that. And then, my chief of staff was telling me yesterday, we're underutilizing Ronsley and his team. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, as we've been digging in deeper, they're producing a heck of a lot more assets and content than I even fully comprehended. And he's like, we can leverage this even more. And that means, you've got more articles, more content, more B-roll and videos for social, all this other stuff. We've used quite a bit of it, but a lot more is accessible. So it's exciting stuff.
Yeah. No, thank you. But, apart from us removing half sentences, if, for example, you're having the conversation and you cover something at the end that actually belonged in the start of the conversation because you touched on that subject at the start, or you had that conversation at the start, we'll remove that and put that there so it's consumable. And the way we think about producing every single episode is it should be like edited chapter in a book. You don't go to an editor and say, I'd like you to edit this manuscript, and they do a grammar check and do a spelling check and give it back to you. They actually make it consumable. You would never read a blog post that's not edited. You would never read a book that's not edited. Why would someone listen to a podcast that's not edited? So that's the way we think about podcast production. When you're expecting people to consume, is there an idea that you have in mind that you wish they got as a result of their consumption? What are you hoping that they get by consuming your work?
A new and fresh perspective. See, what we're looking for when we make a decision, let's say you're an agency owner, people on average today, they're looking at 27 different sources of information before making a buying decision. That trend continues to go up. Just a few years ago, it was 17 different sources of information. Before that, it was about 8 to 10. So some of the things that we're asking ourselves is, why should I work with you? Why is this time going to be different than any other time I've tried in the past? What makes you different than all your competitors and all that other stuff? So there's so much of it that is like, what separates you from everybody else? And so if you're an agency owner and you talk about the same things that everybody else is talking about, then I'm going to mentally opt out. I'm like, okay, so this is no different than any other experience I've ever had or any other vendor that I've ever spoken to. So it's not my thing yet. I'm not really convinced. But then you offer a different perspective, change something. And all of a sudden it's like, ooh, there's some more magic words for you, which is that changes everything, right? That changes everything. And when they go back and they go, oh, wow, that changes everything. The moment they go, that changes everything, now all of a sudden they're recognizing that, where they are and where they want to go, how they're going to bridge that gap. It connects the moment they, in their mind, go, okay, that's what changes everything. And in a sales conversation, you're looking for those wow moments so that when they get to that changes everything. So interesting. When people look at my close rate and they, I don't do a lot of sales right now, but when I was, my close rate was anywhere between 62 and 69%. And when they look at the close rate and they go, how did you do that? I rarely ever ask anybody for the sale. I don't have to ask somebody for the sale. When I'm talking to you, say Ronsley, you and I are having a conversation and it becomes crystal clear. Here's where you're at. Here's where you want to go. And I deliver that new and fresh perspective, and that bridge connects no matter where we are in the sales conversation. You see it in person. They look up at the ceiling, they sit back a little and they go, oh, that's when they go, that changes everything. Then I stop and I go, Ronsley, ask me a question. And your next question is most likely going to be what?
When do we start?
Right. And that's exactly what ends up happening. So in a podcast, the moment people go, oh, okay, that changes everything. Now you deliver that CTA somewhere in the podcast, more tips, information, blah, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden it's like, okay, I'm ready. Let's go ahead and let's have a conversation. But everybody's moment, especially when you're doing it at scale at a podcast, some people, their issue might be breaking free from founder-led sales, and they need that moment where it's like, that's it. Other people are saying, I built my entire business from word of mouth and referrals. How do I go beyond that? And once they connect the dots, like, oh, that's it. Or a lack of predictability. Oh, that's it. Or whatever that is, too dependent on the CEO. So it's like there's a number of different problems or issues. And so at scale, it becomes harder to do this in one conversation. So you have to have these different episodes where you're going to be focusing in on what is one element that allows me to deliver that. Whoa, that's awesome. Now, here's some actual data for your listeners too. So we were looking at our clients and, first we looked at ourselves and we're like, oh, that's interesting. Of the marketing qualified leads, MQLs. So these are people that are not sales qualified. They're not on the phone with us. These are just, they submit their emails and so forth. Roughly 7.5% of marketing qualified leads will end up doing business with us at some point, another coach, but usually it's with us, between 0 and 90 days. But then 42.5% will do business between 90 days and 2 years from now. So we started running this analysis across the board with our clients, and we found something very similar. 0 to 90 days, 7.5% of MQLs, but 42.5 90 days and beyond. And we're like, wow, that's fascinating. What then is the difference between the 7.5% in the beginning versus the 42.5% in the end? And one of the biggest attributing factors came down to consumption. The more they consumed, the more they ended up buying. Now, one of the most recognized marketers on the planet had a conversation with me and he said, so here's the deal. How do I shorten my sales cycle? And I said, well, let's talk about this for a minute. So how long is your sales cycle right now? He says 185 days. I said, okay, so 185 days. And so I said, well, it's consumption that drives conversion. How much content do they need to consume before they end up buying? And so he goes through, looks at his data, comes back, and he says 7.5 hours. 7.5 hours of content, whether it's videos or audio, that they have to consume before they actually become a buyer. That becomes his new metric. How do I get people to consume 7.5 hours of content as quickly as possible? That's how he shortens his sales cycle. So it's consumption that drives conversion. And again, because we're dealing with so many different ways, different insights, there are a couple other core podcasts that I listen to now because now I'm actually enjoying it. But there's multiple different ways to consume content. I See You Everywhere gives you that ability to drive the opportunity for people to consume more content, shorten your sales cycle, increase your close rate. And so there you go.
That's cool. I was actually going to ask you about selling, because I feel like that's a really important part. A lot of people start podcasts to grow their business and to increase sales, increase credibility, increase audience. And usually the revenue part of things, or the profit side of things, is the one that suffers the most for a variety of reasons. And considering your predictable profits, I would love to ask you the question as to, how can we all get better as podcasters to increase our profits and make them more predictable?
Well, here's the thing, right? There's a lot of different strategies, a lot of different ways that you can leverage it and so forth. I think one example I'm going to give you, just because there are so many different ways and strategies depending on the business and a number of other factors, is, when we think of outbound marketing, a lot of people tend to think about marketing as a strategy. Well, outbound marketing is actually not a strategy. There are multiple different strategies inside of outbound marketing. And so one potential strategy would be to say, look, there are potential partners that they're not going to respond to an outbound email. They're not going to respond to a LinkedIn request. They're not going to respond to any of that stuff. But you know what they would respond to? They would respond to an interview request to get on my podcast, because I'm going to give them something. I'm going to give them an exposure. And so now you're able to have a conversation with somebody over a podcast, and you've opened a door for a conversation, began to plant the seeds for a high value relationship. Same thing with potential clients. You can run a podcast and you can say, what, I know who my target market is. I'm going to run a podcast for my target market specifically, and I'm going to interview my ideal prospects. And during the line of questioning, they begin to realize, well, wait a minute, you just said something I hadn't even thought about before. There's a new and fresh perspective. You just said something I didn't think about before. And then you added a little color that makes their lives richer, better, easier, more convenient. And at the end of the podcast, like, well, thank you. That was awesome. Hey, look, I still have another 10 minutes left, on my calendar. I know this is awesome, but ask me a question. And then they'll be like, I'm just curious. What would it be like? What if we did something together? What would it be like to work together? It becomes a lead generation thing, again, for high value prospects. Or your other strategy, again, is just like, when we look at the Predictable Profits operating system, one of the components is setup, which is how to create, capture, and nurture demand. And, so nurture demand, right? When I ask people, what are the strategies that you currently have for nurturing your existing demand? Most people have this blank look in their face. Nurture demand. I don't know. And it's like, okay. So basically, you've lit the fire, you've created a warm prospect, but you've done nothing to keep the fire running. And so what happens to that prospect? They go cold. And then your odds of converting them go way, way, way down. So if you've lit that fire, created warm prospects, but they're in that decision-making process and they go cold, you're losing a massive opportunity. So how are you going to nurture that demand? And podcasting can be one of those ways of nurturing demand by continuing to educate, offer value, and new and fresh perspectives, and so forth, which keeps that fire alive. And again, increases the conversion. So if you were to ask me point blank, if you're like, Charlie, I need to know the exact dollar figure that your podcast has ROI'd in your business, I don't know that I could actually give you a dollar figure. Quite frankly, I don't know that I could actually say the podcast, the actual figure. But what I do know is that it's a formula. If you're baking a cake and you decide all of a sudden that we're not going to put the eggs in, do you get a different outcome? So we know that our buyers are listening to our podcast. We know that our buyers are getting value from the podcast. We know that they're doing this before they make buying decisions. I can't tell you unequivocally it's because of the podcast, but what I can tell you is if we remove the eggs from the recipe, that the results are not going to be the same. So it is that element of the podcast that adds its equation. Everything has to come together in order to drive, very predictable, awesome results.
That was amazing. So I'm very conscious of time. So I want to ask this question before I land the plane. What kind of advice you have for podcasters that are just starting off or are new into the experience of podcasting and either getting impatient and they want results? They basically, most of us, have a podcast to grow our business. And what kind of advice would you have for them?
So, great question. If I created my podcast to benefit me, the idea of I'm doing the Beyond Seven Figures podcast so that I become famous, so that I become known, so that I make more sales. People figure that out, and they're not that interested in listening to a podcast that does nothing more than makes you better. People wouldn't care if it had everything to do with me. So flip the script and ask yourself, how can I make the next 25, 30 minutes one of the most valuable moments of my listeners' time? And for some, that might just be an escape. That's what they're looking for. They're looking for an escape. For others, it might be they're in a period of despair and they need hope. They need hope, whether or not they need hope to understand that, oh, my business will be okay, that it's not a matter of a bad economy, it's a different economy. And now I understand that there's hope or inspiration. Maybe you're bringing in other business leaders that have started maybe in a position way worse than your listener, and you're showing them how they can go ahead and become far better off with a few right steps. When you put your listener, like any business, you have a target market and you build around the target market. When you put your listener in the nucleus of your podcast strategy and you say, okay, what needs to happen in order for my listener to look back after listening to an episode and say, this is one of the most valuable 25, 30 minutes of my day? What would need to happen? You answer that question and your podcast will crush it.
Wow. Charlie, this has been an absolute slice of heaven. Thank you so much.
Very cool. My pleasure.